All right, this is the review for your final exam. So I'm just going to kind of go over some of the key ideas that we've gone over from the 1960s right up through the 1980s. We'll start with the Kennedy era and John F. Kennedy's presidency. Remember, he defeated Richard Nixon in a very close election. Nixon had been Eisenhower's vice president, and John F. Kennedy was very young, inexperienced, but he was a senator, very likable, came across very well on television, very photogenic, telegenic, you might say, and he does, by a very narrow margin, become president. Early on in his presidency, he would face several challenges. First of all, what's known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, where they tried to do a coup and overthrow the government of Fidel Castro. Remember, Castro was a communist, and they did not like him being so close, the communist country being so close. And so the CIA led an invasion of Cuba by anti-Castro rebels, and it was a tremendous defeat. 1,400 rebels were defeated by the 14,000 Cuba soldiers, and Kennedy accepted full responsibility and admitted it was a costly mistake for the United States, and it'd be one of several attempts but failed efforts of the United States to remove Castro and that regime from power, which really it's still there today, even though Castro is dead. His brother still runs it, and it's still communist. So what else with Kennedy? Well, another famous thing was, of course, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. After turning communist and worrying about things like the Bay of Pigs, and that the United States was not going to allow them to exist, Cuba looked to the Soviet Union for economic and military assistance. And the Soviet Union was more than happy to kind of jump on that and strike up a bargain with another communist ally right off the Florida shore, so they could be right there. And seeing an opportunity, the USSR put nuclear missiles in Cuba. And their idea was that they were going to be there as a safeguard to make sure that Cuba was never invaded again by the United States. The United States would think twice before invading Cuba when it had nuclear missiles there. At first they denied they were even there, but then we showed photographs of them, and Kennedy said that it was too close to the United States and that they had to get them out or else. The crisis became known as the closest that mankind has ever come to destroying the planet with nuclear war. It was very close. He set up what was known as a quarantine. He said nothing could come in or out of Cuba until the missiles, we could verify the missiles were removed. The Soviets eventually did back down. They removed the missiles. We also agreed to remove some missiles in Turkey. And the USSR was embarrassed over the incident. Some of the domestic things, of course, the Peace Corps, volunteers were sent to developing nations to go help with day-to-day activities in villages. It really helped to try to change the perception that many countries had of the United States as being kind of like imperialistic, and we're just the best and no one else matters, and we don't care about anything else but ourselves. So the Peace Corps, kind of tried to change that idea. The moon race, the space race, which the Soviets were already ahead of us. They had Sputnik and were orbiting the Earth. Kennedy began a challenge, and he challenged America to put a man on the moon by the end of the century, by the end of the decade, by the end of the 1960s, which was accomplished in 1969 in the Nixon administration. So how do you get there? Well, he poured money into things like NASA. Of course, he was assassinated, as you all know, in 1963. It was a very extremely emotional event. If you hearken back to other president assassinations like Lincoln, you know that it's a very traumatic effect on the country. Johnson comes in, and really he has a huge mandate because people are so sympathetic towards Kennedy that they're willing to give Johnson kind of a blank check. We're going to talk about another blank check later on with Johnson, but for him to go after that and what's known as the Great Society. All right, so he is going to try to put all these social programs to begin a war on poverty, or what he called the Great Society, with the creation of the Economic Opportunity Office. and VISTA, which is the Volunteers in Service to America. It's very similar to the Peace Corps, but it is Americans helping down and out Americans. He wants to, create American jobs, use tax dollars for welfare programs like Medicaid, and help put more money into education and pollution, anti-pollution policies, environmental policies. Really trying to create all these different things for the betterment of America through government programs. Head Start, of course, is one of those programs as well. And there was a whole list. I gave you a whole list of different programs. I'm just going to mention a couple of them. The big thing, though, that was really holding Johnson back, let's just talk 1 second, though, before we get to that one big thing, civil rights. And, of course, the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Act were extremely important for Johnson. Let's go back to the big elephant in the room, of course, was the Vietnam War. Obviously, to prevent the spread of communism, the United States did whatever it took to stand up to communism all over. And you had this idea of the domino theory, believing that if South Vietnam fell to the communists, that all of Southeast Asia might, and it would just fall right to the communists. So Johnson gets a big boost in the war with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, where naval ships were reportedly fired on by North Vietnamese patrol boats. And basically Johnson asked for authorization to do more in Vietnam and to escalate the war. And you're going to hear that. That's going to be a key term, escalation. So the Gulf of Tonkin and escalation, being able to take the war to the next level, add more troops than just advisors to really start massive bombing. The Tet Offensive in 1968, this is kind of like a big turning point of the war, because this is where Johnson really realizes that the war is virtually unwinnable, and that he should not even run for president again, because he is so far down in the polls that he can't even defeat people in his own party. And so we know that Hubert Humphrey is going to become the Democratic nominee, and there's a lot of problems with that. We know we saw the problems at the Democratic National Convention, and how they voted down the war after. We saw things like riots outside of the convention and within the convention. We saw the massive number of protests. And a lot of this had to do with that Tet Offensive, where that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were right there willing to fight step by step and keep fighting until the United States left. Draft protests are going to lead, and all this turmoil within the Democratic Party are going to lead to Nixon being elected president. And with Nixon, he decides Vietnamization is the way to go, and he is going to try to turn the war over to the Vietnamese. Well, he's going to be massively bombing not only the north, but places like Cambodia and Laos, as we slowly remove troops. Late in the war, the government ordered a study of the U.S. involvement, and this was under the Johnson administration. It became known as the Pentagon Papers. They were top secret, but one of its writers, Daniel Ellsberg, leaked it to the press. The report was very critical of U.S. decision-making and why we were there. Nixon did not want this to get leaked out. He did not want this to get published, because people might start asking more questions about what he was doing. And so even though this happened under the Johnson administration, Nixon wanted to keep presidential power as high as possible, and he felt that this might undermine it. He also believed he had lots of enemies within the press. But by a 6-3 vote in New York Times versus U.S. Nixon, the government could not stop. The Supreme Court said the government could not stop the papers from being published, and it cited freedom of the press in the First Amendment. Eventually, in 1973, a ceasefire occurred between the United States and Vietnam. We removed our troops. By 1975, Vietnam was under the complete control of the North Vietnamese, and it became fully communist. Some major court cases during this era. You have Mapp versus Ohio, and this is where some police officers went into a home without a search warrant, and they found some materials, illegal materials, but it was nothing to do with what they were searching for in the first place. And so the Supreme Court said the evidence could not be used I believe this is the prior restraint, that you don't have the right to go in and just search for anything. Or if you have a search warrant to search for something, you can only search for that thing. And if you just happen to see something laying there, it's fine. But if you're like, say you're looking for a gun and you look in a little tiny little package like this big and you find some cocaine in there, no, if you're looking for a gun, you're not going to look into some little tiny so you can't use that even if you find it. So that's the Warren Court. Again, these Warren Court decisions are trying to help the accused. They are giving more or holding up rights of the accused. Gideon versus Wainwright, again, the right to an attorney, not just in federal cases, but also in state cases, so you can't deny someone from having a lawyer. Miranda versus Arizona, one of the most famous ones. The idea that you have the right to remain silent. The police can't force you to say something against yourself. You have to be informed of your rights. You have to be informed that you don't have to speak to the police no matter what without a lawyer present. And again, this became known as the Miranda rights. Baker versus Carr, just going to boil this one down to basically saying that the court said that the districts had to be redrawn because they were unfairly drawn and you were underrepresenting certain groups of people, and so they forced them to redraw one vote, one man, one vote rule. Moving on to kind of like getting into the 70s now, the Nixon, of course, has to resign because of Watergate, and that was kind of like dominating all the news, and so his vice president had also resigned, and so now you're going to get a man by the name of Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon for having any dealings with the break-in or the cover-up or the money and all that kind of stuff. One of the famous court cases from the pre-impeachment, from the resignation in Watergate, was the U.S. versus Nixon in 1974, where special prosecutors ordered Nixon to turn over tapes that he had recorded, and he refused, citing executive privilege, and the Supreme Court ruled that the president was not above the law and that he had to. So this is kind of like a checks and balances. Even though Nixon was not impeached, he did resign. Just a couple last things on Nixon. Go back to Nixon for just a minute and his foreign policies, because that's where he really, he does do a lot of domestic stuff like the EPA and Clean Water Act and, things like that. But his idea of federalism is also seen as more conservative because he wants to give money back. It's called the New Federalism. He wants to give money back to the states in block grants that they can use how they want, and it's not the federal government really dictating to them. It's like the states determine for themselves how to use money. His foreign policy, détente, really is a big word that you should know, which is the relaxation between tension with communist nations such as the Soviet Union and China. Nixon overturned a nearly 20-year policy of not recognizing the People's Republic of China because it was communist. So he's like, okay, we're finally going to say that China is the true China and not Taiwan anymore. We still support Taiwan, but we no longer consider it as China. He visited China. He visited the Great Wall, which was considered a huge news story. Only Nixon could go to China. Nixon also became the first U.S. president to visit the Soviet Union, and he agreed to increase trade and share scientific discoveries and talk about reducing nuclear weapons, which they did in the SALT talks, S-A-L-T, the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, which limited the number of nuclear missiles in their arsenal. Okay, so we get to Ford now after Nixon resigns, and he pardons Nixon, so all that would go away. He wanted to end our long national nightmare. He called it, our long national nightmare is now over. And many people were upset at Ford for pardoning Nixon and kind of getting him off the hook. There was also a huge oil problem. This is when OPEC was formulating, and they embargoed the United States because we supported Israel. And so the price of oil went sky high. The amount of oil we had on reserve diminished, and so it was very hard to get gasoline at that time to meet all of our oil needs. And it really tanked the economy throughout the 1970s, which is another reason why Gerald Ford lost. Jimmy Carter takes over, and he inherits a kind of a mess, domestically speaking, economically speaking. He tries to do some foreign affairs stuff. One of his most important things was, of course, the Camp David Accords. where Carter invited leaders of Israel and Egypt to his private retreat, and he got Israel to be recognized by Egypt. Egypt recognized Israel, and Israel agreed to give back some of the land that it had annexed from Egypt during a war. Soviet Union, Carter would boycott the Summer Olympics because they were being held in Moscow. This was in 1980, but because the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, we embargoed it and did not go. They would reciprocate in 1984 and not come to the Olympics being held in Los Angeles. So the Olympics were supposed to be used for putting aside political differences, and they were being used as political tools. So it was like the exact opposite of what the Olympics were for. The Iran hostage, we talked about that in class. The Ayatollah Khomeini, they overthrew the Shah, and they took American hostages that were in the embassy. And this did not look good for Carter. And eventually, Ronald Reagan easily defeated him because of all the economic issues and foreign issues that Carter could not handle. The Reagan-Bush era, Reagan is elected in 1980, comes into office in 1981. He is shot almost immediately, but recovers. His idea for the economy was the thing we talked about, supply-side economics, where he believed in giving tax cuts to the wealthy, and they in turn would hire new people, and it would increase the number of jobs and increase the tax revenues and get the economy going again. He believed that it was okay to run a deficit so long as you were creating jobs and defeating the Soviet Union, which was his big domestic goal, to get the Berlin Wall taken down and to overthrow communism with economic forces. He also was he put the first woman on the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. And the Supreme Court, during his 2 terms in office, he did get to appoint 3 new judges. And Rehnquist took the court in a different direction than Berger had been. And Warren and Berger had kind of been more of a liberal, progressive, criminal rights direction. And then under the Rehnquist court, it's going to kind of veer more to the conservative way. Some negative things towards the end of Reagan's administration. You have what's known as the Iran-Contra affair. He supported anti-communist groups in Nicaragua and El Salvador, and he was told by the Congress that he was not allowed to sell weapons. However, it sold weapons to Iran to get some hostages released, and then it took the funds from the weapon sales to Iran and secretly funneled those to the anti-communist forces in Nicaragua and El Salvador. Reagan obviously did not trust the Soviet Union. He called them the evil empire. He helped to fund what's known as Star Wars, or SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Gorbachev and he came to some agreements, and the Soviet Union would eventually fall. I'm not going to get too much into George H.W. Bush, because I didn't put much of him on the test. Big things for him. End of the Cold War during his presidency. Fought the first Iraq War, first Gulf War. Soviet Union as it collapsed. You have the Berlin Wall collapsing. You have Poland having free elections. East and West Berlin are going to get reunited into one, and then Germany's going to get reunited into one country again. He does get Saddam Hussein. He builds a coalition of many countries and does get Saddam Hussein to retreat from Kuwait. Troops had invaded Kuwait. The Iraqi troops had invaded Kuwait, and George Bush, the president, got a coalition of forces to force Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. All right, so that's it.